Good evening. I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for your state, or you can also call our weather info line at 1-855-937-4977 to get updates to the forecast through that means as well. We have a fair number of watches, warnings, and advisories out for the state, most of which are with flooding, and most of those are along the Yukon River. We'll start with our warnings, and we'll start up in the Yukon Flats area. We have two warnings out there. The first one is for the Yukon and Porcupine Rivers at Fort Yukon. That's going to be out until noon on Friday. And the other one a little bit down the river, we have there along the Yukon River still, but at Stevens Village until 10 p.m. on Friday. Then moving all the way down, we'll look at other two warnings down in the lower Yukon. These ones are from ice jam, whereas the ones up in the Yukon Flats area are caused by snowmelt flooding. So with our two ice jam warnings, first one there is at Russian Mission. That is going to be active until 4 p.m. on Friday. Then our other one is near Marshall all the way to Mountain Village, and that's going to be in effect until 4 p.m. Friday as well. We have two watches out for both of these areas, looking out until Saturday for those. And then we have another area of minor flooding out by Galena. That's from Galena to Caltag, and that was first started by the ice jam flooding, but as that has receded a little bit, we are getting some snowmelt flooding adding in, resulting in some continued minor flooding for the area. That's going to be in effect until noon on Saturday. Otherwise, we have an advisory for strong winds to the eastern Alaska range, and you could see gusts up there to 60 miles per hour. That's going to start Saturday morning at 6 a.m. and go until Saturday afternoon at 1 p.m. Looking at our Alaska breakup map, we can see those highlighted areas. Most of the rivers are clear here, but with that snowmelt flooding, we are still seeing some flooding in the area, so be mindful of that. And then our rivers that are not as full, we're seeing some ice jam flooding in those. And as we move up north into the Brooks Range and up along the Arctic coastline, note that we do have quite a few rivers that are still needing to melt out, so we could still see some flooding up farther to the north. For our fire weather outlook, we do have wildfire activity remaining low across Alaska, and that is due in part to some of the wet and cool weather that we are expecting, going to limit the potential for fires through the holiday weekend. But we do still have some dead grass from last year that is burnable, and we hope that green up will help to reduce the risk for the wildfires there. So looking out at our fire danger, we'll take a look out first over the Yukon Flats area. We do have some high to very high danger there from some of the grass burning. Most of the state is going to be low to medium, and then we do have some areas in the more southern locations of the interior, high to very high there as well. So be mindful that even though we do have quite a bit of flooding in some areas and some rain expected, that there is still potential for some fire danger. Taking a look at our satellite imagery now, we're watching a couple systems come in from the west, bringing some cloud cover into the eastern portions of the Bering Sea. And then we have in our today map, we can see that frontal system pushing into the Alaska Peninsula, bringing rain to the Alaska Peninsula and areas behind it in the Aleutians. Up north, a little bit colder. We're going to see some snow north of the Pribilof Islands, moving to St. Matthew Island, a mix of rain and snow for St. Lawrence Island. Much of the southern portion of mainland Alaska still seeing some lighter rain showers, with some of the areas in higher terrain going to mix with some snow. Out over the Gulf of Alaska, low pressure moving through from the west, bringing rain and southerly winds all along the North Gulf Coast, down and through much of the Panhandle as well, and some drier conditions up along the Arctic coastline. As we move into tonight, that low is still bringing in a lot of moisture from the south. Continued rain for southeast Alaska, all throughout south central Alaska. Once again, at some of the higher elevations, we could see some snow in the mountains or areas that mix with snow. In the interior, we're going to see some lighter rain showers continuing through tonight, drier up to the north, and our other system that was out over the Bering staying relatively stationary here, just continuing to bring moisture into the Aleutian Islands, southwest Alaska, where you do expect to see primarily rain for those areas. North of the low, still colder from Nunavik Island up through St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait. It could be cold enough for some snow there. As we move into Friday, on the southern side of that, we're going to see a low tracking into the Alaska Peninsula, bringing rain to the areas of Alaska Peninsula and starting to push some moisture from a southerly direction into southwest Alaska and Kodiak Island. Our other low out over the eastern Bering is going to stay stationary, still continuing to bring moisture to much of the state. Colder to the north, mixture of rain and snow as we track up the west coast of the state. Primarily rain once we get into the mainland. That rain is going to extend into interior Alaska, and primarily rain for south central Alaska, even though some of those higher elevations could see some snow. Otherwise, we have southerly winds out through the Gulf of Alaska, continuing to bring rain to the North Gulf Coast and into the Panhandle. Then as we move into Saturday, low tracking in from the west, bringing continued moisture to the Gulf of Alaska. Still a very rainy pattern for much of the southern part of the mainland and for the Panhandle, expecting more rain into Saturday. In the interior, some breaks in the weather, especially in the eastern locations, but as we move farther to the west coast, our low that's just sitting out over the eastern Bering, continuing to bring moisture and cloud cover throughout all of the west coast of Alaska. Some areas starting to funnel in some of that colder air. Could see a mixture of rain and snow moving into southwest Alaska. Then finally for the Aleutian Islands on the backside of this system, clear farther out to the west, but we are going to see some rain for the eastern Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula. Taking a look now at our temperatures, our lows Friday morning in the lower 40s for south central Alaska. Down in the Panhandle, we're going down into the mid 40s. Then Friday afternoon, jumping up into the mid 50s for the Panhandle and into the lower to mid 50s for south central. Saturday morning, going to drop down to near 40 degrees for south central and the mid 40s for the Panhandle. Getting up to the lower 50s to mid 50s for the Panhandle, a little bit warmer as we get farther to the south. And then for south central Alaska, getting up into the mid 50s for most locations. Some of the locations along the North Gulf Coast only get into the mid 40s. In the interior, along the coastline into the 30s, 20s along the Arctic coastline, and in the interior itself into the 40s primarily for those lows Friday morning. Friday afternoon highs getting up into the 60s for some of the locations in the interior, colder up north around 30 degrees there, and then in the 40s for much of the west coast. As we look into Saturday morning, 40s through much of the interior, 20s up along the Arctic coastline, and 30s down the west coast. Saturday afternoon jumping back up into the 60s for all of the interior, a little bit warmer Saturday afternoon than on Friday, and then right around freezing for up along the Arctic coastline, and in the 40s along the west coast. Southwest Alaska, we are expecting temperatures to drop into the mid 30s to near 40 for southwest, and then around 40 degrees for much of the Aleutian Islands. Friday afternoon highs getting up into the 50s for southwest Alaska and upper 40s for the Aleutian Islands. Saturday morning lows dropping down to the lower 40s for southwest and staying in the 30s, mid to upper 30s for the Aleutian Islands. And then finally on Saturday afternoon jumping up into the mid 40s, mid to upper 40s for southwest and in the mid 40s for the Aleutians.
Hi, I'm meteorologist Mike Ottenwiller with the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center. I'm here to bring you your latest in the 2023 Alaska breakup outlook and update. So taking a look at this picture behind me is kind of a good way to start out. This was the Big Eddy ice jam upstream of Galena last week. This was taken by our Riverwatch team as they were flying over the area on May 19th. And you can see there plenty of ice, a little bit of a jam, and that has obviously since moved away from that area, moved downstream, and now we're tracking this long run of ice and a surge of higher water behind it as it makes its way towards the lower Yukon. So as always, we've been encouraging folks to stay flood ready in this very dynamic and historic year. And with that, a couple tips for how to stay flood ready. Do the plan, make your plan before it happens. Do you know if you're in a flood prone area, a low-lying area? Do you know if there's an ice jam upstream or downstream from your location? What's the fastest way to get to higher ground and how will you do that? Do you have a good communication plan with your family? And what roads or areas are the most likely to flood if the water should start to rise? With some of these ice jams, we have seen the water rise quite quickly, and so this is a good time now to take action and make sure you have your plan in place and know how to communicate with those that you love so that you can stay safe. So let's talk about our couple components that have contributed to this dynamic year. The snowpack continues to be a contributor, especially for the upper Yukon. Ice thickness and strength continues to become less of a factor now as most of our ice has moved out, but we're still watching the lower Yukon where ice remains intact, although it is deteriorating. And of course, our spring weather patterns with a very cool April that has really allowed this to be a more dynamic year. And we started out May cool, then we warmed up to normal temperatures. Thus, we increased a lot of snow melt into the mountains, from the mountains into the tributaries, and that has really helped to drive those water levels up, especially for a lot of the communities along the Kuskokwim and the Yukon. So with that, what does our current snowpack look like? Well, in general, it's deteriorated from the lower elevations. You can see here really stretching out from the Yukon area all the way down through the Kuskokwim, just a little bit left there in southwest Alaska. So really for snow melt, we don't expect a whole lot more to contribute now, but we still have plenty of high water working its way from the Dawson area on down to the west. North of the Brooks Range, we still have plenty of snow melt, and so we'll be keeping an eye on that area as a potential contributor for the rivers up there like the Sag River. As we look at our high temperatures expected as we go into the end of this week and into the weekend, we're actually going to see a little bit of a cooling trend, which should help to temper those snow melt rates. So a little bit less water being added into the tributaries, which should be some good news. Generally, we've been in the 70s up in this upper Yukon area, and we should see highs only in the 50s and 60s as we head into the weekend with a lot more cloud cover. We do expect things to continue to hold around 60 for the headwaters of the Kuskokwim River, but again, we're not really looking for a whole lot more increase in temperatures going into this weekend. As we look out a little bit farther in time to the first week of June here, you can see generally our long-range outlook from the Climate Prediction Center has most of the southern half of the state in cooler than normal conditions. It's only if you get up north of the north slope, that you start to see a little bit above normal conditions up there. So this again should help to slow the snow melt from any of the higher elevations. And other than that, though, we expect breakup to continue to move on down towards the lower reaches of these rivers and out towards the Bering Sea. So looking at the breakup map now and the flood potential that we have, still really focused on snow melt here for the upper portions of the Yukon, with some places still being in the moderate range, such as Fort Yukon and Stevens Village. Those are two of the areas that have been hit pretty hard and continue to see high water. And then as we get down towards the lower Yukon, that's our real next area of focus of concern. Some ice jams between Russian Mission and Mountain Village continue to be in place. They are moving at various times, and it's hard to know exactly what the latest information is. So stay in touch with your local emergency officials and weather.gov for the latest information, but that's the area that we're the most concerned about now as we watch these ice jams slide towards Amonuk and Aluknuk. Looking at the breakup map, you can see mostly open for much of the state here. It's just really along the Brooks Range for the Sag and Colville rivers, and out a little bit there towards the Kobuk River that we still see some ice conditions holding in place. And then again, those ice conditions still by the lower Yukon, where we have a few warnings and advisories that we'll talk about here in just a minute. So in general, what happened as far as the breakup dates? Well, it was with our track as late as we thought it would be, about 9 to 11 days late across the Kuskokwim, but we have now declared the Kuskokwim done with breakup. The Riverwatch team has moved out of that area and is now focused on the lower Yukon. And taking a look at those conditions across the Kuskokwim, you can see all of our river gauges indicated dropping in water level, and you can see no ice there on any of the cameras from Bethel over to Crooked Creek area. And so even though conditions were pretty historic in those spots, we are now seeing things start to have that water subside and continue to subside. How about for the Yukon? Well, in general, it was pretty late there as well, 4 to 8 days late for most of our areas, and we do still have Amonuk left to go, so we'll be tracking that one, but again, expecting about 4 to 8 days late from that normal time frame. So here in the next couple days, probably into the weekend, is when we expect Amonuk to finally go out. Starting upstream and looking downstream from Fort Yukon, here's a couple shots from yesterday, just showing that high water primarily from snowmelt. This is around the airport terminal and then again around the tribal hall. Those water levels did not come up quite as high as they did with the initial breakup, but they remain high now, so a flood warning is still in effect for Fort Yukon. Galena, this is where that surge of high water that was behind the initial front has really taken its time to move through, and this is the piece of water that we continue to track here in the later stages of the breakup. This high water is going to have to make its way all the way down through the lower Yukon, so you can see we probably have crested at Galena in the last 24 to 48 hours, but it's going to be a slow track on the way down now, so that's the piece that we are continuing to monitor very closely for you. Here at Russian Mission, you can see that water level come up very quickly there. Sunday and Monday climbed very quickly along the banks as ice jammed about 18 miles downstream. We've had some fluctuation since then, but it really is hard to determine exactly where that breakup front and that ice jam is located downstream of Russian Mission now. Here we can see, though, when that jam did move just a little bit, the water levels at Pilot Station rose several feet, on the order of about 5 to 6 feet. And so that's that ice jam that we are tracking the most closely now. And we'll get to our warning map here in just a second to take a look at that. For the shore fast ice, this is what we're now watching near Amonica and Luknuk to make sure that that ice and that water that's coming has a place to exit. The good news is we're seeing some deterioration courtesy of our ice desk. So we're hoping that that continues and we'll have a space for that water to go out into the Bering Sea. So finally, our watches and warnings map again. Warning for Fort Yukon, a warning for Stevens Village, and then warnings really stretching now from Russian Mission all the way out through Mountain Village. A watch downstream from Amonica to Luknuk. Again, that's our target area where we have the most concern as those jams start to move their way through. But once it jams up, it can, of course, lead to a very quick rise on those waters. And so that's where we want folks to be flood ready. We want to say a huge heartfelt thanks to all of the folks who have contributed to the observations that we've received this year. It's been an overwhelming support and effort. Tons of information coming through on social media, tons of information from phone calls and emails. We really appreciate it all. Of course, our hearts and our thoughts are with all of those who have been affected by the floods, and we just want to help to stay as far ahead and keep folks as safe as possible. Thanks for joining us.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start with a look at our flying weather. We have multiple lows moving through the pattern, which is going to bring widespread MVFR and IFR conditions to much of the Bering Sea and Gulf of Alaska. So starting off in the Gulf, we do have widespread MVFR pushing up into south central Alaska, with IFR conditions through much of the North Gulf Coast and down into much of the Panhandle as well. Interior Alaska is expecting to be VFR for Friday morning, but MVFR conditions up north. More low pressure systems moving through the Bering going to bring widespread MVFR conditions moving into the west coast as well, with some IFR conditions from St. Lawrence Island down through the central Bering and out by the eastern Aleutians. Then on Friday afternoon, that area of IFR will push farther to the east, south of the Alaska Peninsula, but our other area of IFR is going to linger from St. Lawrence Island area in the Bering Strait down into much of the central Bering. Widespread MVFR elsewhere in the Bering Sea and continuing to rest along the west coastline. As we move up north, IFR and MVFR conditions along the Arctic coast, VFR conditions remaining for interior Alaska through Friday afternoon, and then MVFR conditions down in the Gulf of Alaska extending into the Panhandle. On Saturday morning, continuing to see more lows moving through the area. We do expect a lot of IFR conditions out over much of the Bering, extending out over Kodiak Island and into southwest Alaska. VFR conditions for much of the Panhandle, but pretty quickly transitioning over to MVFR and IFR as we get into the Gulf. Some MVFR conditions in south central Alaska, but still VFR conditions through much of the interior. And then as we move up north in the Brooks Range and into the North Slope, we do expect MVFR conditions and IFR. As we move down into the Bering Sea, we have widespread IFR conditions with areas in MVFR for the Pribilof Islands and up into the St. Lawrence Island area. Finally, on Saturday afternoon, continuing to see those MVFR conditions throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, with areas of IFR moving in from the south towards the western Aleutian Islands. Up by the Pribilof Islands, still seeing IFR conditions up through the Bering Strait area, and MVFR conditions along much of the west coast and down into southwest Alaska. Those areas in southwest are going to extend out to the east over south central and down throughout the Gulf of Alaska. MVFR conditions expected to return Saturday afternoon for the Panhandle, with IFR conditions throughout much of the Gulf. Way up north, we are expecting to see IFR with intermittent MVFR. For the passes up north, we have Anaktuvik starting off VFR, dropping down to marginal conditions in the afternoon. That is going to be the same at Adigan Pass. Then for Lake Clark and Merrill, both expected to be MVFR throughout the day on Friday, as well as at Rainy Pass and at Windy Pass. Moving to the east, we have Isabel Pass also going to be MVFR throughout the day. Mentasta Pass is expected to be MVFR. Worst conditions are going to be on the south side, expected to clear up towards VFR conditions as we get closer towards the north. Dunedin Pass is going to be MVFR throughout the day Friday, as well as Portage. And finally, Chilkoot and White are both going to be IFR, improving to MVFR conditions in the afternoon. Taking a look at our freezing levels, we do expect some areas of colder air up to the north surface freezing line right into the North Slope area, some warmer air closer towards the Panhandle area from the east. As we move out to the west, pockets of cooler air coming in behind our frontal system out over the Bering Sea, with warmer air far to the south, with freezing levels getting up to as high as 10,000 feet approaching the eastern Aleutian Islands. For our areas of icing, we have a few isolated areas south of the Aleutians. Then we have more moderate icing expected above 6,000 feet for St. Lawrence Island. Light icing expected through much of the southern portion of the mainland, above 6,000 feet in the eastern interior, above 5,000 feet for South Central, and above 4,000 feet for northern portions of the Panhandle. Moving into our jet stream, we do have strongest portion of the jet south of the Alaska Peninsula, up to as high as 120 knots out of the east, and then some grading down in those wind speeds as we get closer towards South Central Alaska. Another portion of the jet up to the north in the interior out of an easterly direction, 60 to 70 knots expected. Down to 9,000 feet, winds out of the southeasterly direction, 35 to 40 knots over much of the mainland, and then weaker winds around 25 knots over the Panhandle. Strongest winds south of the Aleutian Islands up to as high as 70 knots out of a westerly direction and 40 knots in the southern Bering. Down to 3,000 feet for our winds, flow circulating around our low that's out over the Bering Sea up to as high as 40 knots on the southern side of that low, approaching the eastern Aleutian Islands, and down to 30 knots out of a northerly direction as we get by the western Aleutians. North of that low, out by the Bering Strait area, we do have easterly winds around 40 knots, and another area of easterly winds around 40 knots is going to be up along the North Slope coast, but much of mainland Alaska dropping down to 20 knots or less, primarily out of a south to easterly direction. Pretty calm winds out over the Panhandle, but winds out over the Gulf out of the west at 40 knots. For our turbulence by South Central below 6,000, in the interior below 4,000 feet, up by the Stewart Peninsula also below 4,000 feet, and all along the Aleutian Islands between or below 3,000 feet to the west and 4,000 to the east.
Hi stargazers, I'm Trace. You've spied the summer triangle, peeped fall's heavenly G, and glimpsed winter's giant rupee, but have you spotted the super spring triangle? Let's complete this set. Every spring, 3 bright stars are easy to find, so hit the darkness at 11 p.m. looking west any night this week. But this asterism is so big, we're going to have to use the wide angle. So start with Regulus, a bright blue-white star in the constellation of Leo the Lion. This is the lower point of our super triangle. Next, look up and to the left to find Arcturus, the brightest star in Boötes the herdsman from 2 weeks back. Look carefully. Can you see that Arcturus is orange? It's a very different color than Regulus. Now head down and to the left for Spica, the brightest star in Virgo, the maiden. Spica is the dimmest of the 3 and the bluest too. The super spring triangle, 3 constellations, 1 asterism. Behold its majesty and keep looking up.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back from the marine section of the forecast. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. Out for the Yukon Delta coastline, where we do have some shore-fast ice, we are seeing signs of some weakening and melting of that ice going out from the shoreline to about a mile or a mile and a half out from the shore. On a bigger picture scale in the Bering Sea as well as the Chukchi Sea, we are still seeing some melting and spreading of the ice, and we expect that to continue through the weekend, where we could also see some small chunks of shore-fast ice breaking off for associated coastlines with the Bering and Chukchi. Taking a look down in the southeastern portions of the state, Friday marine forecast. In the inside waters, we have southerly winds, 15 to 25 knots, strongest as we get closer towards Lynn Canal area. Out over the Gulf waters, we have south to southwest flow, 15 to 20 knots there. Then on Saturday, inside waters, all south, all around 15 knots. Out over the Gulf waters, see a much more easterly component to the winds, 20 to 25 knots there, up to as high as 30 as we get to the far northern locations of the Gulf waters. Then for South Central Alaska, primarily southerly flow. In the Gulf waters, we have 15 to 20 knots expected, 20 knots in Prince William Sound as well, 15 knots through Cook Inlet. Then on Saturday, flow shifting quite a bit to be more easterly. We are going to see winds around 20 knots by the Barren Islands, getting up to as high as 30 knots out of that easterly direction farther to the north of in the Gulf waters, 30 knots in Prince William Sound as well. Northerly winds, 20 to 25 knots for Cook Inlet. Then as we move down into the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, we'll start by Kodiak Island. Southerly winds expected there around 15 knots. And then we have southerly winds still for the Alaska Peninsula, 15 to 20 knots are expected. On Saturday for Kodiak Island, we're seeing westerly component to the flow, 20 to 25 knots there, strongest over the Gulf waters. And then for the Alaska Peninsula, continuing to see westerly flow here, 20 to 25 knots. For the Aleutian Islands, starting for the central and eastern Aleutians, west to northwest winds around 20 knots there. And then as we move out by the western Aleutians, pretty similar, that northwest wind around 20 knots. On Saturday, still seeing westerly winds 20 to 25 knots for the western Aleutians, a little bit stronger for the central and eastern Aleutians, 25 to 30 knots, remaining out of that westerly direction. Along the west coast of the state, we're going to see southwest winds, 15 to 20 knots south of Nunavut Island, still southeast north of Nunavut Island, but a little bit weaker there, 10 to 15 knots expected. And then out by St. Matthew Island, northeast winds 20 knots, southwest winds 25 knots for the Pribilof Islands. Then for Saturday, north of Nunavut Island, easterly winds 10 to 15 knots, southerly winds south of the island, 15 knots. And then out by St. Matthew Island, northerly winds 25 knots and westerly winds 25 knots for the Pribilof Islands. Along the Arctic coastline, easterly flow 20 to 30 knots expected, strongest farther to the east, and then northeast winds down the west coast of the state, mostly around 20 knots, some areas a little bit weaker. Then on Saturday, still seeing easterly flow along the Arctic coastline, but that has dropped down to 15 knots, and then along the west coast of the state, primarily northerly winds up in the northwest coastline, 20 to 25 knots, dropping down as we get closer towards the Bering Strait, 10 to 15 knots there. Recap of our weather for Friday. We are expecting a lot of stronger, or a low pressure system bringing in stronger southerly winds, a lot of rain expected with that. And that is going to aid in some of the flooding that we are seeing through many of the areas along the Yukon. We do have some flood warnings out, snowmelt flooding in the Yukon Flats area and ice jam flooding in the lower Yukon. If you're in those areas, please check our website for further details. Meanwhile, here on Friday, we have a low moving across the Alaska Peninsula, rain expected there, pushing out to the east in Kodiak Island as well. Southerly flow out over the Gulf, bringing rain to south central Alaska and some lighter rain into the interior, and rain also out by the Panhandle area. Some of the higher elevations and some of the mountains could see a mixture of snow. Then on Saturday, we do have low pressure pushing through the Gulf of Alaska, bringing more southerly flow and more rain expected in this very rainy pattern that we do have here. And that's going to bring rain for the southeastern portions of the state throughout south central Alaska. We're going to see some snow at some of the higher elevations there. And then in the interior, finally starting to clear out, allowing for some warmer temperatures there on Saturday afternoon than we've been seeing Thursday and Friday for the interior. Going to see some rain making its way into the Brooks Range. Some areas could see some snow in those locations. Then down the west coast, we've had a low that's just lingering out over the eastern portions of the Bering Sea, continuing to bring rain and snow to areas of the northern Bering and the coastline of Alaska west coast there. Rain and snow mixture for St. Lawrence Island, and then rain down through southwest and into the eastern Aleutian Islands. With Alaska weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.